emergency door is broken.
Yeah.
My seat is broken.
Yeah.
I'm not jumping.
Okay.
I just walk out in it.
Mayday, mayday. The words cut through the static of the radio, but they came too late. Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, had just lifted from Ahmedabad's airport on June 12, 2025. It was supposed to be a normal trip to London, filled with families, students, and business travelers. But within seconds of takeoff, something went horribly wrong. At 1:38 p.m., the aircraft climbed into the sky, only to lose thrust from both engines less than a minute later. Pilots scrambled, voices tense, alarms blaring. The desperate call for help echoed across the airwaves. Yet there was no time for rescue. In just 32 seconds, the jet transformed from a rising machine of steel and promise into a falling inferno. The crash site was horrifying. The plane plunged directly into the campus of BJ Medical College, shattering concrete, tearing into classrooms, and sparking a massive fireball that lit up the sky. Chaos ruled as students and hospital staff rushed outside. Screams, smoke, and flames turned an ordinary afternoon into a scene of devastation. By the time the fire was under control, 241 passengers and crew had perished, along with 19 people on the ground. It was one of the deadliest air disasters India had seen in decades, a tragedy that began with a simple mayday but ended in silence. A routine flight turns deadly. It began as any other journey. Air India Flight 171 was filled with the quiet chatter of passengers settling into their seats. Some were excited to see family in London, others tired after long waits at the airport, but no one imagined the horror awaiting them. The Dreamliner gleamed under the afternoon sun as it taxied down the runway. At 1:38 p.m., the plane lifted gracefully, its engines roaring with power. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Families relaxed, children gazed out of the windows, and the cabin crew moved calmly through their routine. But the peace lasted only seconds. Less than a minute into the climb, both engines failed without warning. The steady hum that passengers had trusted fell into a dreadful silence, replaced by the sudden drop of altitude. The cockpit filled with alarms. First Officer Clive Kund fought to keep the aircraft steady, while Captain Sumit Sabharwal called out commands. Panic spread through the cabin as the aircraft began to sink. People screamed, some clutched loved ones, and others prayed. The Mayday call reached air traffic control, but by then the fate of Flight 171 was sealed. The plane, once a symbol of safety and travel, had turned into a falling coffin. In only half a minute, a routine flight transformed into one of India's worst aviation nightmares. Seconds after takeoff, the first few seconds after takeoff should have been routine, climbing smoothly, engines steady, passengers settling in. Instead, terror began almost immediately. At just 32 seconds into the flight, both engines lost thrust. The aircraft, still low over Ahmedabad, shuddered violently as alarms blared inside the cockpit. First Officer Clive Kund, hands locked on the controls, tried desperately to stabilize the jet. Captain Sumit Sabharwal, the monitoring pilot, called for procedures, but nothing could stop what was already in motion. With fuel flow cut, the powerful Dreamliner became nothing more than a powerless glider, far too close to the ground to recover. Inside the cabin, fear spread like wildfire. Passengers gripped armrests as the sudden silence of the engines filled their ears. Some shouted, others sobbed. The cabin crew shouted for calm, but panic overtook the narrow aisles. Through the windows, the ground rushed closer, faster than anyone could process. Then came the final moment. The crash. The aircraft slammed into the campus of BJ Medical College, tearing through buildings and exploding into a fiery inferno. Concrete shattered, flames roared, and chaos consumed the site. In just seconds, life had turned into death, and the city of Ahmedabad would never forget the moment when Flight 171 fell from the sky. Fire at BJ Medical College. The crash site erupted into chaos the moment Flight 171 struck the campus of BJ Medical College. The massive jet tore into classrooms and hospital buildings, sending concrete and glass flying in every direction. In an instant, the campus became an inferno. Flames engulfed wreckage and nearby structures. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, and the screams of the injured echoed through the streets. Medical students, doctors, and staff who had been inside rushed outside, some burned and bloodied, others scrambling to help. What had been a center of healing was now a battlefield of fire and debris. The explosion rattled the entire neighborhood. Cars parked nearby burst into flames. Walls collapsed, burying people beneath rubble. Students who just moments earlier had been attending lectures were now pulling survivors from the wreckage. Ambulances struggled to reach the scene as panicked crowds flooded the roads. Firefighters battled the blaze for hours, but the intensity of the jet fuel kept the flames alive, consuming bodies and buildings alike. For many, there was no chance of survival. Lives were cut short instantly. The medical community, usually tasked with saving lives, now faced its worst nightmare, treating their own colleagues, neighbors, and friends in the middle of an unfolding disaster. Families faced the horror. As news of the crash spread, families rushed to BJ Medical College and nearby hospitals, desperate for answers. The air was filled with cries, prayers, and the unbearable silence of uncertainty. Some clutched photographs of loved ones, begging officials for information. Others collapsed in grief as lists of survivors failed to include the names they hoped for. Temporary forensic tents were set up, but what lay inside broke hearts even more. Bodies were burned, mangled, or reduced to fragments, making identification slow and painful. Days passed before many families received confirmation, and in some cases, remains were so damaged they could not be properly identified. For parents, children, and spouses, the wait became torment. Every ambulance arrival sparked a rush of hope, only to be crushed moments later. Officials struggled to control the crowds, while grief-stricken families accused the airline of failing them. Medical staff, already traumatized, now faced another burden: breaking the news to relatives. Scenes of mourning filled the city, with funerals carried out in haste as bodies were released. Families who had waved goodbye at the airport hours earlier now faced the unthinkable task of burying their loved ones. For many, the tragedy of Flight 171 would leave scars not only in their hearts, but in their lives forever. One survivor, many victims amid the wreckage and overwhelming death, a single story of survival emerged, one that shocked the world. Out of 260 people, only one walked away alive, a British national of Indian origin named Vishwash Kumar Ramesh. He had been seated in 11A when the engines died. Somehow, through sheer chance and the cruel randomness of fate, he survived while hundreds around him perished. Pulled from the wreckage bloodied and dazed, Vishwash was rushed to the hospital. His survival was described as nothing short of a miracle. Doctors called it an impossible escape, as the section of the fuselage he occupied remained partially intact while flames consumed everything else. For the families of the dead, his existence brought mixed emotions: relief that at least one life had been spared, but also anguish that their loved ones had not been so fortunate. Reporters swarmed him, desperate for answers. Survivors' guilt weighed heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, the scale of victims was unbearable. 41 passengers and crew lost, 19 more killed on the ground, and over 60 injured in the campus fire. The contrast was haunting. One man carried out alive, while families collected ashes, fragments, and memories of hundreds more. Vishwash's survival became a symbol of hope, but also a grim reminder of how much had been lost. Air India under pressure. In the days after the crash, Air India faced an avalanche of pressure from every direction. Families demanded answers and accused the airline of negligence. The government pushed for accountability, while global aviation authorities closely watched. Compensation announcements came quickly. 115 zalardard for each victim on the ground under Indian law, with Montreal Convention payouts expected for passengers. But no amount of money could ease the fury and heartbreak of grieving families. Protests erupted outside Air India's offices, with crowds holding pictures of the dead, chanting for justice. The airline's reputation, already bruised from past tragedies, now carried the weight of one of the deadliest disasters in decades. Inside the company, fear spread among staff. Pilots, shaken by the loss of colleagues, began calling in sick at record numbers. Within just 4 days, 1/2 of crew members had requested stress-related leave. Flight schedules crumbled, forcing the airline to cancel or delay dozens of routes. Passengers complained, but the airline could barely cope with the emotional fallout. For the first time in years, Air India faced not only financial losses, but a crisis of confidence from both employees and travelers. Every headline, every broadcast carried the same message: how could this have happened? And who would take responsibility? Sick leave surge among crew. The emotional shock of Flight 171's crash spread far beyond the grieving families. Inside Air India itself, the tragedy shattered morale. Pilots and cabin crew, who had flown alongside Captain Sabharwal and First Officer Kund, were suddenly faced with the reality that even experienced colleagues could be lost in an instant. Fear seeped into every briefing room, every cockpit. In the first week after the crash, over 100 flight crew members filed for stress-related leave. Official reports noted at least 112 pilots and attendants requested time off, citing anxiety, nightmares, and inability to perform safely. Flights were delayed, rescheduled, or canceled entirely as the airline scrambled to find replacements. Some pilots openly admitted they were too shaken to fly. Others refused certain routes, worried that the cause of the crash had not been explained. Passengers arriving at airports found themselves stranded, their frustration boiling. But for Air India's workforce, the issue ran deeper. They were carrying grief for lost friends, worry for their own safety, and pressure from a public demanding answers. For many, the cockpit no longer felt like a place of pride, but a reminder of vulnerability. The surge of sick leave was not only a labor crisis, it was a sign that the human cost of this disaster extended far beyond the crash site. Early probe begins just days after the wreckage cooled. Investigators began the grim task of piecing together what happened to Flight 171. Teams from India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, joined by experts from the United States, swarmed the crash site. Blackened debris was carefully tagged, engines examined, and scorched fragments of the fuselage lifted from the ruins of BJ Medical College. Every piece of evidence mattered. The first question was simple yet urgent: was it mechanical failure, or something else entirely? By late July, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued its first statement. After inspecting fuel control units across the global 787 fleet, they found no sign of systemic faults. Air India followed suit, urgently checking its own fleet of Dreamliners and 737s. No defects were discovered. That left investigators staring at a darker possibility: human error. The spotlight quickly shifted from machine to man. The flight crew's records, health, and final actions became the focus. Both pilots were seasoned, one meticulous, the other passionate. On paper, they seemed incapable of such a disaster, yet the switches controlling fuel flow had been found in the cutoff position. The mystery only deepened. Was it an accident, or was it intentional? The probe had only just begun, but already it was raising more questions than answers. Spotlight on the pilots. With mechanical failure ruled out, attention turned to the men in the cockpit. Captain Sumit Sabharwal, 56, was the pilot monitoring that day. He was known among colleagues as meticulous, calm. His record was spotless, with over 15,600 flight hours, 8,200 of them on the Boeing 787. First Officer Clive Kund, only 32, was the pilot flying. Though younger, he had already logged 300-400 hours, more than 100 on the Dreamliner. Passionate about aviation, he was inspired by his mother's long career with Air India. By all accounts, these were professionals, not reckless novices. Yet, the facts were hard to ignore. During takeoff, Kund's hands would have been fully occupied, focused on flying the jet. That left Sabharwal monitoring systems as the only person in position to move the fuel switches. But why would he? Investigators struggled with the contradiction. A veteran captain with decades of service, suddenly linked to a catastrophic act. Families resisted the idea, defending his reputation. Colleagues described him as dependable, even quiet. But suspicion was growing. Could an intentional act have brought down Flight 171? Or was there still an unknown factor hidden in the chaos of those final seconds? As the spotlight intensified, the search for truth turned personal and painful. Black boxes recovered among the twisted wreckage. Investigators searched for the most critical evidence, the black boxes. These devices, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, were buried deep within the scorched debris. Days of sifting through rubble finally paid off when recovery crews unearthed both units, surprisingly intact despite the fire and impact. Hope surged. These small, charred boxes held the final moments of Flight 171. The data, the voices, the truth hidden in static and numbers. Once shipped to laboratories, specialists began downloading the recordings. The flight data recorder showed a chilling fact. Both engines had lost power after the fuel control switches were moved to cutoff. But machines alone don't tell motives. All eyes turned to the cockpit voice recorder. Families, officials, and the public waited anxiously, knowing the tapes might reveal whether this was a tragic mistake or something deliberate. In aviation, black boxes rarely lie. They capture every sound, every warning alarm, every word spoken in those desperate seconds. The world braced for what investigators would soon uncover. For now, the boxes promised clarity, but also carried the weight of confirming suspicions no one wanted to believe. Fuel switch mystery. The black box data revealed one undeniable fact. Both engines of Flight 171 shut down because the fuel control switches had been moved to cutoff. These switches are among the most critical in a cockpit, designed to control fuel flow to the engines. With them turned off, a jet as advanced as the Boeing 787 becomes nothing more than a powerless glider. Investigators were stunned. How could both switches be in the off position just seconds after takeoff? Was it a mechanical glitch, or had human hands deliberately moved them? Experts weighed the options. Some wondered if turbulence or vibration could have caused accidental movement, but engineers explained the switches were built with safeguards to prevent that. Others questioned if faulty wiring or a short circuit could trigger the change, but no evidence supported it. That left the most troubling possibility: intentional action. Since First Officer Kund was flying with both hands on the controls, suspicion shifted toward Captain Sabharwal, who had been monitoring. Could a respected, experienced captain have deliberately starved the engines of fuel? The mystery deepened, and with no clear answers, investigators prepared to release a preliminary report that only raised more disturbing questions. Was it human error? By mid-July, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau released its preliminary findings. The cause was listed as fuel starvation after both control switches were moved to cutoff. But the report stopped short of explaining why. Was it a mistake? Could an experienced pilot really make such a fatal error seconds after takeoff? Aviation experts were divided. Some argued human error was the only logical answer once mechanical failure had been ruled out. Others pointed out the improbability. Fuel switches are not buttons a pilot can bump accidentally. They require deliberate movement. The crew's records were combed through line by line. Captain Sabharwal's spotless 30-year career made him an unlikely suspect of negligence. First Officer Kund, though young, had shown nothing but passion and skill. If this was human error, it didn't fit the profiles of either man. Families of the victims demanded answers, rejecting the idea of simple error and insisting on deeper investigation. The public grew restless. Was this a tragic slip of the hand, or something darker? With pressure mounting, investigators admitted only one thing was clear: someone had moved the switches. Whether through mistake, confusion, or intent, Flight 171's engines were shut off by human action. Black box shocks experts. When analysts finally listened to the cockpit voice recorder, what they heard changed everything. The final moments of Flight 171 were not filled with chaos or confusion, but eerie calm. The black box captured First Officer Kun's voice rising in panic as he noticed the engines had lost power. In contrast, Captain Sabharwal sounded composed, even cold. He gave no indication of surprise, no effort to reverse the fuel cutoff. To experts, that calm wasn't just strange, it was chilling. Aviation specialist Anthony Brickhouse, with decades of air disaster experience, explained the gravity of the recording. In no known emergency would a pilot cut off fuel to both engines. Once those switches are flipped, the aircraft loses thrust, and without altitude, there's no time to recover. The 787's cockpit is designed to warn pilots instantly. Lights flash, alarms sound, voice alerts scream. It's impossible not to notice. The recording suggested that Sabharwal didn't miss it. He let it happen. This wasn't a moment of panic or technical confusion. It was a deliberate action. Brickhouse noted how experienced pilots feel the difference the moment engines shut down. The sound, the pressure, the aircraft's movement. It all changes. Yet the captain showed no urgency to react. The black box didn't just capture a tragedy. It hinted at intent, and that revelation shocked the aviation world. Did the captain do it? As more details from the cockpit voice recorder surfaced, the question no one wanted to ask became impossible to avoid. Did Captain Sumit Sabharwal intentionally bring down Flight 171? His calm during the crisis, his lack of response to the engine shutdown, and his position near the fuel switches painted a disturbing picture. While First Officer Kun's voice cracked with alarm, the captain sounded almost detached, like a man who wasn't caught off guard at all. For investigators, it was the moment everything changed. Could a respected pilot with over 15,000 flight hours truly do such a thing? Sabharwal had never shown signs of instability, but now mental health experts were brought in. They looked into his recent life, grief over his mother's death, changes in work routine, and signs of emotional fatigue. Colleagues recalled him being quieter in the weeks before the flight, more withdrawn. Still, no one could imagine he was capable of mass murder. The idea shattered trust in the cockpit. Pilots around the world watched closely, uncomfortable with the possibility that one of their own may have weaponized his role. No final conclusion had been made, but the evidence whispered louder than words. If Sabharwal had done it, it would be one of the most horrifying betrayals in aviation history. One man, alone in the sky, choosing silence over survival. Mental health questions. With suspicion growing around Captain Sabharwal, investigators turned to a factor often overlooked in aviation disasters: mental health. Could grief or hidden psychological stress have played a role in his actions that day? Sabharwal had recently lost his mother, someone he was reportedly very close to. Friends said he hadn't been the same since. He had also undergone a recent schedule change, flying longer domestic hauls and fewer international routes, a shift that may have disrupted his routine and sleep patterns. Though subtle, these changes began to form a troubling pattern. Mental health experts interviewed colleagues, family members, and supervisors. Some described the captain as unusually quiet in the weeks before the flight, less social, more distant. Still, no one had raised alarms. Pilots undergo medical checks regularly, but psychological evaluations are not always mandatory unless signs of distress are obvious. In this case, there had been none, at least not on the surface. Experts stress that pilots, like anyone, can suffer in silence. Stress, grief, and internal struggles can go unnoticed until it's too late. If Sabharwal did indeed shut off the fuel, it wouldn't be the first time mental health played a role in a crash. The tragedy of Flight 171 reignited global debate. Should airlines do more to monitor pilots' emotional well-being? And how do we protect passengers from the quiet storms we can't see? India's past air disasters. Flight 171 was not India's first brush with aviation tragedy, and sadly it may not be the last. As investigators dug deeper into the crash, the nation was reminded of a grim history, a string of air disasters that had left scars on families, airports, and policies. Each crash, though different in cause, carried a heavy cost in lives and trust. One of the most haunting comparisons came from Air India Express Flight 1344 in 2020. A crash during heavy rain at Kozhikode that killed 21 people. Before that, in 2010, Flight 8012 at Mangalore overshot a tabletop runway and plunged into a ravine, killing 158. These weren't just isolated incidents. Patterns emerged: unstable approaches, ignored warnings, poor infrastructure, and crew fatigue. Time and again, lives were lost not just because of accidents, but because of human error and overlooked systems. And then there was the darkest chapter of all, Air India Flight 182, the 1985 bombing that killed 329 people mid-air, the deadliest act of aviation terror in Indian history. Now, with Flight 171, history repeated itself in the worst way. People asked, have we learned nothing? How many more tragedies will it take for safety to come first? Not just in machines, but in the minds and hearts of those trusted to fly them. Flight 1344 rain crash. On the rainy evening of August 7, 2020, Air India Express Flight 1344 was nearing the end of its journey from Dubai to Kozhikode, India. It was part of the Vande Bharat mission, a lifeline operation bringing home stranded Indians during the COVID-19 pandemic. Passengers on board felt relief. After months of fear and uncertainty, they were finally returning home. But that relief turned into horror within seconds. Kozhikode Airport is known for its tabletop runway, perched high on a plateau with no margin for error. As the Boeing approached around 7:40 p.m., it faced strong monsoon rain, poor visibility, and a dangerous tailwind. The crew attempted landing twice, both unsuccessful. Despite warnings and a call for a go-around by the first officer, the captain tried a third time. The windshield wipers had reportedly malfunctioned, and the view was dangerously obscured. When the aircraft finally touched down, it landed too far down the slick runway and failed to decelerate. It skidded, slid off the edge of the plateau, plunged into a gorge, and broke into 3 massive pieces. 21 people died, including both pilots and 2 children. Another 167 were injured. It was a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes danger doesn't come from the sky, but from choices made in the final, fateful seconds before wheels touched down. Flight 8012 Tabletop tragedy, May 22, 2010. It was just after sunrise when Air India Express Flight 8012, a Boeing 737, descended toward Mangalore. Onboard were 166 people returning from Dubai. Like Kozhikode, Mangalore Airport also sat atop a tabletop runway. High above the surrounding terrain,